AMT, Aluminum Model Toys, is a model company that was started back in 1948 by Wes Galugli Sr., attorney at law. It was a side business to his law practice. Galugli had connections with the Ford Motor Company and wanted to make promotional model cars for the dealerships. The factory was in Troy, Michigan, and their first products were 1 to 125 scale pre-assembled promotional models of the 1948 Ford four-door. They were made using cast aluminum and painted in stock Ford colors using official Ford paints. The idea behind this was simple. Most dealers could not keep cars with every color in stock, so the models would give them a three-dimensional object to show the customer so they could see what a car would look like in each color and make their choice. They were close replicas of the real thing because AMT had worked closely with Ford. In 1956, AMT invested with Eric Erickson to establish SMP, scale model products. The reason for this was to make inroads with General Motors as well as other car companies, and AMT's close relationship with Ford would have made that a bit awkward. The models of all the promotional car manufacturers in the 1940s had sturdy construction, but they weren't like the die-cast models we think of today, as very few of the parts actually worked. The hoods and doors didn't open, the suspensions were molded in one piece. Now, obviously, given their name, AMT made their first models out of aluminum, but ironically, these would also be their only models made out of aluminum. An AMT employee named George Totiff had devised the sliding pillar tooling design, which allowed them to make complex shapes in plastic. This allowed for a faster and cheaper production of the models. After that, they only produced promotional models in plastic, but one problem did crop up. They used a cellulose acetate that turned out to be prone to warping, but eventually they tried styrene and found success. In the early 1950s, Galugli turned over AMT's daily operations to George Totiff so that Galugli could focus on his law career. AMT designed their own models, but subcontracted much of the molding to other companies, which has always been a common practice with toy and model makers. By 1957, AMT was thinking about ways to expand the market for their products. They had already noticed the rising interest older kids had in customizing both their promotional models and their flywheel powered toy cars. In 1958, when their promotional model runs were completed, AMT added several customizing parts to the styrene kits that they were experimenting with and introduced the 3-in-1 customizing kit series. The response was outstanding, and by 1961, AMT needed their own production facility. This led to putting the entire operation under one roof in the factory on Maple Road in Troy, Michigan. That same year, AMT just completely bought out SMP. SMP also made models that could be assembled in any one of three different options, and by now AMT had fully adopted the idea, as well as the SMP logo, which allowed them to do both Ford and General Motors without any conflict. AMT produced promotional car models up until the 1990s, but the market for these slowed down considerably in the mid-60s. The few promotionals they still did were really just for the popular cars, and they learned that the dealerships were no longer giving them away. They were selling them to customers. On top of that, the car companies began charging the model companies to use their names and designs, so they were really no longer truly promotional models. They were just basically a commercial product at this point. Since AMT had already paid for the licensing, it just ramped up the production of its kit model business. That seemed to be where the money was at anyway. As a way of expanding the market for their kits, AMT began to work with real car customizers like the famous George Barris, who did the Batmobile, and Dean Jeffries, who did the Monkeys Mobile, amongst many other car customizers. They also had suggestions of their own on how modelers could create their own customized model cars. From 1959 to 64, AMT had a marketing genius by the name of Bud Anderson. He attended car shows and model contests across the country, creating a buzz over AMT's products. He became pretty well known in car modeling circles, and there's a story about how he got his eventual nickname. Supposedly, in 1961, during a lunch break from a model contest, Bud was walking down the street with another AMT employee. A group of boys who were competing in the contest were passing by when one of them saw Anderson, pointed at him and said, "Hey, there's that cat from AMT." The name stuck. He was now Bud the Cat Anderson. AMT jumped on this and tweaked the name to be spelled with a K because it was in line with the K spelling for custom in models that were being made in conjunction with George Barris. AMT even went so far as to have the art department create a cat caricature that was used in marketing some of the custom kits. From that point on, Bud was known as the Cat from AMT and became car modeling's first true celebrity. It's a good thing that AMT had people like the Cat and that they got rolling on these kinds of updates and changes, because in 1963, George Todeff left AMT, taking with him his considerable experience and talents. Todeff went to start his own competing company, Model Products Corporation, only 7 miles away. By 1965, they had their own kits for sale. Despite this, AMT's kit sales picked up sharply in the 1960s, but MPC was gaining popularity. Since AMT was facing real competition in the kit model car business, they decided to branch out with other themes and types of kits. Some of these include models based on TV shows and movies, as well as science fiction models, which brings us to our next phase, and an interesting story it is. AMT came about making the Star Trek kits because of a direct effort by AMT executives who were looking for ways to expand their product line. In 1966, AMT executives saw the early trailers for the Star Trek television show and thought the ship would make an interesting subject. AMT used an advertising firm out of Phoenix to help them make the deal. The account manager was Steve Poe, who, a couple of years later, would write a book called The Making of Star Trek under the pseudonyms Stephen Whitfield. In the book, he notes that in the original script, the Enterprise never had a transporter. The script originally called for the starship to land, but this would have required expensive sets, impractical model filming, and very expensive special effects, so the idea of the shuttlecraft was born. The original shuttlecraft was too complex, so a more simplistic one was designed. But even this simplified idea was outside of the show's budget. Then Steve Poe called asking about the rights to make models of the show's vessels. Perfect timing. A deal was struck where AMT would provide Desilu Studios with both the full-size shuttlecraft prop and, separately, the interior sets that could be broken down so they could shoot from different angles. AMT could not know it at the time, but they just scored a major success when, in August of 1966, they signed a contract for the plastic model rights to the Star Trek TV series. The problem was that filming began before the full-size shooting model was ready, so the now famous transporter was devised as a cheap, quick and dirty plot device to move people around and keep the story pace from slowing down. The rest is Hollywood history. Steve Poe would remain as the primary liaison between AMT and Star Trek for the entire run of the show, and thus began AMT's extensive relationship with Hollywood and models. AMT Starship Enterprise not only became one of their best-selling kits, but it appeared in the show twice, once as the battered USS Constitution in the episode The Doomsday Machine, and as the Enterprise herself outside of the space station window in The Trouble with Tribbles. These props were off-the-shelf AMT Enterprise models. The early versions of the kits were known to be flawed, with raised panel lines and windows, but it was and still is a sought-after kit. AMT also made a kit of the Klingon D7 battlecruiser in 1968. It came out later because the Klingon ship did not appear in the show until the 3rd season. Even after this series was off the air, AMT kept making new Star Trek kits. I know, I had all but 2 of them. In 1974, they introduced a model of the Galileo shuttlecraft, a roughly 3/4 scale exploration set consisting of a phaser, communicator, and tricorder, and the 1:112 scale figure of Spock firing his phaser at a 3-headed snake. In 1975, they issued the Romulan Bird of Prey, the Enterprise Bridge, the K-7 space station, and a smaller scale 3-piece ship set. They sold well enough that Aurora actually leased the Mr. Spock mold from AMT for 2 years, and AMT has never stopped putting out new releases of Star Trek subject matter. At this time in the late 60s, AMT was also making fire trucks, aircraft, bulldozers, semi-tractor trailers, NASCAR vehicles, vans, pickup trucks, concept vehicles, and some pretty other crazy stuff. In 1969, they released a series of semi-tractor trailer kits that included a California hauler, Chevrolet Titan GMC Astro, Peterbilt, Kenworth, Autocar, and the White Road Boss. In 1971, AMT issued models of the American LaFrance firefighting trucks. But cars were still their staple subject matter, and their growing catalog of cars is testament to that. The big change for AMT came in 1978, when Lesney Products and Company Limited of England, who were famous for making Matchbox die-cast vehicles, bought AMT and moved the company from Troy, Michigan to Baltimore, Maryland. This, of course, closed the Maple Road factory. In 1982, the ERTL Company purchased AMT from Lesney, renamed it AMT ERTL, and moved the company to Dyersville, Iowa. Luckily, the AMT-ERTL relationship was a stable one that lasted 24 years. In the early 1990s, AMT released brand new kits with new tooling for some of their older kits, such as the 55 Chevy Bel Air, the 66 Ford Fairlane GT, the 58 Edsel Pacer, 1960 Ford Starliner, and the 57 Chrysler 300. In the late 1990s, AMT did something new. They re-released pre-assembled and painted versions of these kits. They were sold as the Masterpiece series and were nicely packaged in foam, including a certificate of authenticity. They were beautifully finished and featured with white wall tires and a lot of details, including painted engines, suspensions, and interiors. They showed more detail than any of the previous promotional models. They truly were in a class by themselves. The models included the 57 Chrysler 300, the 1960 Ford Starliner, the 62 Chevy Impala SS convertible, the 62 Pontiac Catalina, and a 66 Buick Riviera. But then ERTL itself was bought out by Racing Champions in 1999. Production of plastic kits continued, but it seems the quality dropped. Then Racing Champions was bought out by the Japanese company RC2 in 2004. But RC2 didn't really want the model company, so they sought buyers. AMT was sold in 2007, and companies such as Stevens International and Model King reissued AMT kits. After license producing their kits for a few years, AMT was purchased outright by Round 2 of South Bend, Indiana in 2012. Round 2 is making an effort to re-release some of the classic AMT catalog, and the kits are available from them, as well as in hobby stores and, of course, online retailers. Additionally, some new kits, based on modern muscle cars, have been released in AMT's Showroom Replicas series. These kits are reminiscent of the days of AMT's famous promotional models. Some kits, like the big 1-350 Star Trek Enterprise from the original series, have been created with all new tooling and have been released to great success. The original promotional models that were made by AMT are still traded on the secondary market, but I warn you, they can get costly. They have a pretty strong following. With AMT and MPC brands back in the hands of model car guys, many of the great model kits are being produced again, and modelers have been supportive. I think Bud the Cat Anderson would be proud.